Hello and welcome to PFF Fantasy Football Podcast. I'm your host, Ian Hartitz. Very special edition of the pod today. We have another edition of the 10 question series. I love to bring on some of the finest minds in the industry to, just let you people know what they're thinking. Because as much as I would like to think I'm on top of everything, we're going to make all you listeners smarter by bringing on the guys that we definitely know are at the top of this industry. And that way, if I am wrong about something, great, they'll tell us, then we can all be smarter together. With that out of the way, joining me today, the father of modern science, chief rocket scientist over with the Fantasy Football Astronauts, who you can support on YouTube and Patreon, JetPack Galileo at JetPack Galileo on Twitter. Truly, JetPack, one of the best accounts out there, whether it's, just your wide receiver methodology, general prospect evaluation, or, making Alie-Cox like 5 times the size that he actually looks like when he's on the field. I love everything you do, man. Thanks for coming on the pod.
Hey, what's going on, brother? Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Absolutely, man. So we got the draft around the corner. And the main reason I wanted to have you on is because, let's face it, you've been absolutely crushing I think the last 3 years at least. I'm not exactly sure of the timeline that you had on your correlations there. But basically, you have an evaluation process. I think you were specifically talking about wide receivers. And you've been outperforming draft capital, man, which, I just spent one of these episodes, I think this week or last week, talking about how important draft capital can be. I do think it's fine to spend a lot of these early months, before guys land on their teams. It's fine to look at the prospect, evaluate them, the best of your capabilities and stuff. But I do think sometimes people get a little bit too far overboard. And then we have folks, taking Terrence Marshall or Rondale Moore ahead of someone like Jalen Waddle, who, let's face it, we kind of knew the NFL was ahead on. So just starting things off, man, talk a little bit about your evaluation process and how you've managed to be so successful in basically, beating out these NFL teams so far in terms of the fantasy production at hand, despite, in your own words, not having the opportunity to scheme the plays or go to pro days or anything like that.
Yeah, I think that's a question that almost everybody has. Everybody is a fan of whatever team they have, and they say, "Oh, that was a dumb decision," or "I would have done this differently." And so that idea like exists out in space, and you don't really know until you start to measure it. And so that's kind of our goal, was to say, hey, if I'm going to, really be serious about, how am I going to apply this idea to fantasy, or how am I going to test myself to improve my process? So let me start measuring my grades. Let me start recording things. And then what I started to recognize is, okay, as I get these film grades out, I'm just as good as the draft, or, I can compete with even NFL guys just by watching the film and creating my own methodology around that. So, ultimately the strategy there was, in terms of fantasy, that there is a massive hole in player evaluation. So we have kind of like the two general ideas, which is we take a guy's college productivity, and then we take like draft capital or what the NFL thinks about them. And then we create an idea of, well, this is what his talent looks like. And in that space, we need something to say, okay, well, really all of the college production, that's just a guy's resume. Mm-hmm. That's just what he did on paper, but that doesn't tell me how he works. That doesn't tell me how he thinks. That doesn't tell me anything about that. Like, we can look at Ian's resume and I can say, oh, okay, he did this or that, and he had this many followers, and he, put out these kinds of numbers. But until I read your tweets or watch your videos, right, then I don't really know what it is to add you on, right? Yeah. And so, when PFF is hiring you, it's one thing, again, to say like, oh, he worked at this place before or whatever. But then as soon as you go to your Twitter, it's like, oh, this guy's hilarious. This guy can do all sorts of things, right? And then it seems
like in a lot of the process, not even so much prospects, but I've noticed this in fantasy, just kind of border like the rankings to start the season. Too often we are looking at just the resume. We're looking at what happened last year instead of looking at what should happen next year. And that's, it kind of infuriates me when we have that attitude about certain players, like all the Deebo Samuel news right now, where people, I think smartly, are being like, okay, especially in Dynasty land, probably should be looking to sell him right now based on all the uncertainty out there. So it's almost like these players have a great season when, and all of a sudden they have this great resume. But if we're really being objective about it, it's like looking forward, maybe not going to be exactly what we want or what we've seen in the past.
Right. Yeah. So the idea for me, what I'm evaluating is really two things. I'm evaluating somebody's movement skill or their movement capability, and then their process and their strategy. How do they solve problems on the field? And that is different than charting, right? So charting would be what you guys do at PFF, or reception perception, right? Where we're just saying, okay, what's the success rate of this play, or how does he match up here? And is he checking this box, right? And more of what I'm doing is saying, okay, what's the quality of this player's movement, right? How does he slide or transition? And then what is he thinking, right? How does he use his eyes? Those kinds of things. And when we're talking about, does the resume travel or does the player's skills and talents travel? That's what I'm trying to identify. What does he do? How does he solve problems? That's what's going to translate to the NFL. That's what goes with him to training camp, not something that he did in college.
That's one of, I think he just straight up tweeted that line. And I loved it. This was your quote. You don't take your stats to the NFL, you take your skills. I think that's rather brilliant. And we see that with, some of these, I think, for example, Romeo Dobbs is someone who I've been looking at a little bit more recently, calling myself a lifelong fan after putting in about 2 days of research into the guy. But it's interesting when I see guys like him and Matt Corral, where you start reading like the quote unquote negatives on them. And it's almost like, they weren't asked to do things that we do see more so at the NFL level, whether it's, not being in a pro style system, running too many RPOs, just facing a lower level competition. And we're almost penalizing them on things that they didn't even have the opportunity to do otherwise. So in terms of, skills over stats, I hear you, but are there stats that you particularly lean on to help quantify those skills? Because that's always been my biggest issue with like the film versus the quote unquote film versus analytics debate that we kind of always have in this industry. It's like, ideally, we're finding analytics and stats that help quantify exactly what we're seeing on film. I think the answer is a happy marriage of both. And, anyone that's trying to brush aside the other one, maybe just being a little bit lazy or not understanding enough of what we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah. I mean, part of what we're trying to do is create our own analytics with the film grading. So I write a number down and then I have an objective idea of what I'm talking about. So that initially I'm creating a new analytic. But what I've started to use now is the PFF stats. And I think that's really exciting. Just to say, okay, there's more specific things where I'm not able to capture the entirety of a guy's film. And I know you guys watch every play. So it's, okay, let me dig into that a little bit more. And that's been pretty exciting to see. But as far as like analytical profiling and doing the resume work, I do find that to be valuable. What happens is we usually end up, on Twitter or in that universe, people rearrange basically the same data. Everybody is looking at a player's market share. Everybody is looking at a guy's breakout age. And I think that's all valuable. But if you're in a, more competitive league with dynasty guys, everybody is using that same language and they all have an ability to recognize those things. And so we're all just rearranging that same data. So the question then becomes, okay, what's my edge here? I need to create an edge somewhere else. And so going into the premium stats like PFF or, creating your own film grades, I think that's where you're going to find an edge.
I think is separation one of those things that you're especially looking at? Because look, I'm not trying to shit on like next gen stats here. They're great. You can call them a competitor, PFF, whatever. But if you look back at like kind of their leading separators and just purely based on the separation they're charting, you see guys like Jimmy Graham. I think it wasn't Heath Miller. No, it was Vance McDonald, I think, led it 1 year because, and then like Hayden Winks, I think, made a good point about this before. Like you watch some of those plays, and it's just like the defense is gladly giving up the underneath shit. It's not actually these players going out there and separating. So maybe that separation stat in and of itself, only used overall, isn't very good. But anyone that has watched wide receivers, yourself and all the listeners out there, we know how important separation it is and that it is a skill. Is that something that you're trying to like quantify on a 1 to 10 scale when you're watching these guys? Because really big, small, fast, whatever, if you can separate, that's the ultimate goal of being a freaking receiver.
Yeah, totally. I'll share my screen with you if that's all right.
Yeah, sure. Let me
hop into that.
All right, all you brother. Yeah, YouTube crowd, we are continuing to screen share. Love being able to basically, just do a solid to all you out there. I don't think I have the ugliest face in the world, but if we can we'll have some film and whatnot going in the meantime, why the hell not? Okay, now I stop sharing.
So here's how I do my film grades. And the basic idea is I have 5 main traits and I grade these on a scale of 1 to 5. And then that adds up to create like a final film grade for me. That's, what you see when we talk about the film grades. But what goes into the back end of it is where we get into that conversation of, okay, what am I evaluating for separation, or what am I evaluating for those things? So I run through, okay, what does a player do in his route? How is he identifying the defender's space, right? How is he attacking his leverage? And then there's things that I'm grading differently is, okay, how does he create lateral displacement versus what is he doing with his hip sync, right? And those are different skills. And I think one of the challenges that we have when we're evaluating these players' movement quality is we'll have a guy who can do one thing really well, where he can like give a guy a shake, right? But that doesn't necessarily apply to his ability to translate that into a curvilinear motion like a speed out. So Alec Pierce, I think, is a good example of this, where he has a good enough shake at the line. If you watch him play against Alabama, he's rocking those corners with his release, and he's actually doing pretty well. Ritter's just under a ton of pressure, but he's performing well there. And really his challenge is not, okay, can he create a little bit of lateral movement? It's how does he translate that into speed outs or speed ins, digs, those kind of routes. And you'll see it all the time with him. He'll slip or he'll fall or he'll stumble, or it will take him more time to transition into that motion. And so for me, what does that do? That reduces his overall viability when we're talking about how does this translate to the NFL game. Now his route tree is limited. Yes, I can run him on curls a little bit, or yes, I can run him on posts and go routes, right? That's going to be his bread and butter. But in terms of what's his intermediate game, I'm not as confident with him there. And so his overall fantasy value is going to be down because his volume is going to be different. So ultimately, that's what we're after, right? Is to say, hey, how can we, translate this to the game, and get specific about what am I seeing from this guy athletically?
Now, major part of anyone's athletic ability is unfortunately injuries. Like if you play Madden, or in my case, NCAA football, and you don't turn injuries off, like what kind of monster are you setting yourself up just to be under the constant wrath of these injury gods? And unfortunately, one of the things you pointed out in a recent tweet is that like this class from top to bottom is filled with guys that are, either currently dealing with injuries or have had major ones, impact them in the somewhat recent past. So Jameson Williams and, John Mechie directly coming off ACL injuries. George Pickens isn't too far, ahead of them in that recovery. Drake London, Treylon Burks, even Justin Ross, obviously with the neck thing, have had issues in the past. How worried are you about these issues for purely 2022 stock or potentially beyond? I was reading a good article that Josh Hernsmeyer tweeted out recently talking about how ACL recovery for running backs and linebackers has been particularly, lacking and just tough to come by. Now, I think that also it's more directionally correct than anything, because those two positions, I think we're seeing the shortest career span as well, might have something to do with the guys getting injured. But just in terms of these wide receivers coming in, are the guys that you're really more worried about this injury recover with than others?
Yeah, so the first guy that stands out to me is Jameson Williams, and this has a lot to do with his body type. So both him and John Mechie, tore their ACL, and they're on basically the same recovery timetable. But Jameson is more slender, and he's built a lot like Will Fuller. So when we're coming up with a comparison, Will Fuller is literally perfect for him in terms of the way that they play, but also in their potential recovery process and how they might struggle through that. Jameson, at least from what I was seeing, he's training at the same place Odell was, and so obviously we just saw Odell rehab and spend all this time, and then he ended up tearing his ACL in the Super Bowl, right? And so you're playing a guessing game with the ACL stuff, and we can say, oh yeah, the technology is better, the surgeries are better, we're improving there, but overall there's a little bit more risk, and because of that, I'll bump guys down maybe a spot, right? It's not going to be a ton. But I am saying, okay, this timetable to return, I'm not going to expect Jameson Williams to be the Jameson Williams that I saw at Alabama his rookie year. I'm going to wait for that for his second year, right? I'll be excited about that after I see it. But in terms of investing right away, I'm okay with bumping him down, one spot. Again, not a ton.
How about for George Pickens? I saw you sending out some videos of him today and, seemingly pretty impressed with the way he was out there moving around. He's kind of already had the 1 year. I understand he was able to get back out there, but he might be someone where we're actually seeing him too impacted by the recovery right now that he should be further along with than, obviously someone like Jameson or Mechie.
Yeah, so you're looking for a confirmation of, okay, does he, have what he used to have? And so I think we saw in the last few games of the season, he wasn't quite there yet. But then at the combine, he's running 4.47, right? And so okay, some of that speed and some of that explosiveness is back. And that's really exciting. Same thing with Jalen Waddle, right? He had the broken ankle. He came back at the last game of the season, and he didn't look good, right? But he played. And so that, okay, he was healthy enough to play. They're clearing him. And then you have all this time for him to recover even more in camp and all that George Pickens is also getting. And really, it's the same thing, right? By the time the season comes around, you're not worried about Jalen Waddle. And really, I think the same thing with George Pickens. You're not going to be worried about him as much as you would be, of course, a Jameson or a John Mechie.
That's something I've been noticing in the kind of the conversation around running backs going into this year. Zeke and Cordarrelle Patterson both got hurt played pretty poorly through the injury, and they're really getting dinged for that way more than someone like Derrick Henry or DeAndre Swift, who just got hurt and was out. So like they were giving us nothing, but they weren't like pulling down the fantasy squad when you're trying to play them anyway through the injury. Don't be holding an injury against like Pickens, more so against him than like Jameson, just because Pickens was able to go out there and gut it out. Same thing with Jalen Waddle. Waddle was going as like wide receiver 48 last preseason, and it made me just angry talking about it every single time. There was one beat writer who in like early August talked about how Waddle like got up slowly, kept practicing, wasn't hurt, but the beat writer was like, yeah, can't afford to get hurt again. Like, yeah, no shit, man. Like you can say that about every single player in the entire league. So really with these injuries, I do think you see guys like Waddle who it's just, one of those factors that's being really weighted against them far more than other players that, when I think you're more objective about it, might actually have a bigger issue in the immediate future. JetPack, another fun little Twitter trend you got going on. Your hashtag arrogant hands notes. It's what it sounds like. Like this is the sort of analytics I like, man. Something that we all see, we understand what it is, and hey, let's try to keep track of it as well. Kind of like with the PFF's big time throws. Like people are like, well, "What's a big time throw?" It's a big time throw. It's what you think it is. It's the tight window elite throw that you look at your friend across the couch and you're like, "Holy shit! Did you just see that?" With the arrogant hands, is there anyone in particular in this class that stands out from watching him where you're just like, my God, this dude can snag everything?
Yeah, so I think Jahan Dotson is the guy that everybody recognized, or he came on the scene in 2020 with that big catch against Ohio State, and that's really where he flashed on SportsCenter top 10, all that kind of stuff. But he's
poor
a guy
Denzel.
that
no, it wasn't Ward. It was oh my God, Sean Wade. Poor Sean Wade.
Yeah, but he's that guy that he definitely flashes the arrogant hands, and he can go up and he can pluck it anywhere. But there's actually a bunch of guys in this class. I would say definitely Pickens, Burks, and Justin Ross would be the other guys that their hands really stand out. But yeah, Dotson I think is definitely a fun guy to watch. I ended up comping him to Brandon Lloyd. So I know that their 40 times are different, all that kind of stuff. But in terms of them being a slimmer guy, the utility is going to be a little bit different. Brandon Lloyd is a little bit of who I see in Dotson.
Do you care about weight as much these days? I mean, Dotson coming in, 178, 5'11", because I think in the past we might look at him and some of these other guys and it's like, okay, if they're under, $185 or something, like, yeah, they need to be a slot receiver. But man, we've seen Mooney, Devontae Smith. Yeah, I just feel like in today's era, like I don't want to hear about how few undersized receivers there were in the year 2000, 2010. Like since we had those like Steelers and Ravens, just classic playoff battles about 10 years ago, I feel like football is almost a different sport. So is weight even really factoring into your process much these days? Or is it just something like, yeah, if you got more, great, but if you can play as a smaller receiver, fuck it. Fuck how much you weigh. My God. Sorry, everyone. Didn't mean to drop 3 in a row, but I'm getting excited here. Okay.
Yeah. Well, all those guys in the 80s and 90s, they're all 175, right? And all the heroes of old. But I think to me, I don't care about weight as much as I care about physicality.
Okay.
And that's where I think we get trapped, right? You can have a 185 guy be not very physical, a 190 guy be not very physical, and that will trap him up. So that is one of Dotson's flaws. We can say, oh, maybe this is related to his weight or not. But yeah, you guys have a score right there, 5 out of 10. I'd say that's pretty fair.
Yes,
his challenge is he gets into his route and he doesn't necessarily have a solution if somebody's got his hands on him, right? Okay. And that, related to weight or not, that is going to be a problem. And just like we're talking about with Alec Pierce being his role being limited or his utility changing, it's going to be the same thing with Dotson. You're going to want to keep him out of those situations. And so, yeah, it's physicality that I think matters the most.
All right. So at the position, seems like consensus across the industry, big 5 receivers. In PFF's order, we got Drake London, Garrett Wilson, Jameson Williams, Chris Olave, and Treylon Burks. Seems like that's what I'm seeing throughout the industry as well in the fantasy ranks and all that. Do you agree that those are the big 5 receivers, like pretty much consensus?
Yeah, I would match those guys. I think for me, I have Pickens over Olave. Just like what we're talking about, there's a physical element to the game that I think Pickens brings that Olave doesn't. And Olave to me is more of a wide receiver 2 kind of guy. Pickens, I think, can be the bulldog and run in there and be available all the time. One concept I like talking about with routes is irreducibility. That's a new thing. Jamar Chase is a really great example of that. So even if you're not a great separator, it's, I can always be available to the quarterback at any time. That's irreducibility. So George Pickens is really great at that. Even if he's not separating, which he has the ability to do, he's always available. Same with Drake London.
Do you think these bigger, I wonder if with Pickens and Drake London, if they're almost being typecast as like a non-separating big body wide receiver, just because they're bigger. And now we're used to all these wide receivers coming in, barely even pushing 200 pounds sometimes. Because like when I hear the complaint, I haven't watched as much Pickens as I have Drake London stuff. But when I hear this stuff about London not being able to separate, that seemed to be kind of the verdict on him early. But you pull up the film and I just don't really see it out there, man. I understand he's not like a 4-3 burner necessarily, but he's still got the route running. And, I think there is a case to be made that having that sort of physicality, like, okay, you might take the long speed over physicality if it was a 1-for-1, but that physicality can help make up for a lot, I think, for some of these receivers that maybe aren't quite as quick-footed as we would prefer.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. Drake London to me is like a jumbo Keenan Allen almost.
Nice.
So he's tenacious after the catch. He's got good lateral agility. He plays the slide really well. He looks like a basketball player. I know you're going to hear that a lot, but that's really the vibe you get from Drake London. And just like you're saying, I think the separation concerns with him are overdone. The question that I do have is the vertical separation, right? So how much speed is he able to win over the top? You don't see a lot of that. And so, maybe he's a 4.5, 8, 4.6, guy, and that's okay, right? You can still win with that if you're tenacious after the catch. When we look at all of these guys who are 4.6 guys that succeed in the league, they're all physical players like Drake London. So I'm not too concerned there.
And also, I don't know that we need to continue using like this 4.5 to 5 second period of a player's life as like the end all be all
right, yeah.
of their actual speed. Like how many more times do we need to hear that Jerry Rice ran a 4.7? Like, I'm not sure who spiked his water that day or what was going on there, but like that shouldn't completely be changing someone's analysis on a player, particularly with some of this stuff we're getting now about their game speed. Like when I hear that Treylon Burks, was registering one of the fastest speeds on field last year, shouldn't that matter more than that he ran, 4.55 one day in March?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. When you're hitting the miles per hour stuff that's showing up, I think is really exciting. And so that's one, when we're talking about analytics that I care about, that's definitely one that I'll look at.
I think those could feasibly just erase all the combine drills eventually, because that's what we're trying to replicate with the combine drills. And I respect the goal of what they're trying to do, but it's 2022. We don't need to have the same damn drills we were looking at 40 years ago trying to do this. So one of the things you said about Drake London, jumbo, Keenan Allen, love that. I don't think there's enough, qualifiers or descriptors in front of these comps. I've seen some people have funny tweets about it, there's 5 Jerry Rices in this class and all of this. How many Deebo Samuel comps are we getting out there? It's okay to put poor man's, rich man's, jumbo, somebody plus, like a better version of them. Do you have good comps for these 5 players? Do you have comps? I guess we'll be the judge of how good they are and all that. I'm sure you feel good about them. But, Drake London, Keenan, or jumbo, Keenan Allen, do you have other comps for these top 5 wide receivers that you're particularly fond of?
So with Pickens, I settled on Kenny Golladay.
Okay.
I'm pretty happy about that. Good Kenny Golladay, not recent Kenny Golladay.
It's amazing, man. The guy has one bad year and everyone acts like he's never caught a football. Like Lions Kenny G was a baller.
Yeah. That's what I see in Pickens though, right? You got about the same 40 time, about the same, size, speed, all that, and they both failed at hurdling on their highlight tapes. So, for me, that's very clear. But yeah, comps are my love language. This is how I get to know these guys. And just, I think running through old historical players is so much fun as well. So yeah, Kenny G's a good one for Pickens. And then Treylon Burks as Cordarrelle Claypool. I know you're entertained by that, but
oh my God, I love it. I don't like it. I love it.
Yeah. So the deal there is Cordarrelle Patterson was this freak athlete, first round pick, all this stuff. And maybe he didn't, check certain analytical boxes, but the flaws that he had in his game that basically didn't allow him to transition to wide receiver in the NFL are very similar to what Treylon deals with. So Treylon checks all these boxes as far as like how fast he is, freshman or sophomore SEC breakout, those kinds of things. And people get really excited about them, but there's wide receiver basics that he doesn't understand. And everybody will pull up that Alabama tape and say, oh, look at him cooking these corners that Alec Pierce also was able to cook, right? Or he's putting up great stats, and I think that's definitely worthwhile. But when we're talking about route strategy, he's very rudimentary, and I think that AJ Brown comparisons or Deebo Samuel comparisons are way too greedy. Like, those players were both way more advanced than he was, and so he has a bit of learning curve. And I would treat him more as a prospect. I'd treat him more like a Terrace Marshall. And we saw rookie Terrace Marshall, and that was a disaster, but we were all pretty excited about him generally, right? Here's this freak athlete who has a lot of development to do. And I think that's what we're going to see with Treylon Burks. The utility that he gets, maybe they do use him in the run game or things like that. That's where you're going to get your fantasy value, not necessarily from him translating to being the guy week one out on the outside.
We have shades of Dante Moncrief, which is scary, but look, you can't.
That's another good one.
Yeah, but you can't, like, to me, that's a compliment. Like, you can't necessarily just look at that last, week one game we saw Moncrief with the Steelers where it just went terrible. There was a stretch, man. I remember, really being in on Moncrief when, like, he had like one of those last 12 games with Andrew Luck. He scored 10 touchdowns type of stretches in there. So yeah, we can't comp every single player to an all-pro. That's why having, kind of a deeper 2000s to 2010, knowledge of all these mediocre players can get you pretty far in the comp game. What are your thoughts on Garrett Wilson? Because he does have, it's, Olave is the one that's always getting, look how smooth he is out there. Garrett's just this, I think it's been fair to say, like, one of the more unpolished receivers to come out of Ohio State, but maybe that's just because he's such a souped up athlete. I've seen Emmanuel Sanders comps out there. I think Derek Brown from Fantasy Pros had Santonio Holmes, which I liked as well. Do you have a good one for Garrett Wilson you like?
I do not. So he's hard for me to place because I get in trouble because I, almost say Odell Beckham, right? I don't want to disrespect Odell in that way though. So for me, he's been the toughest one. What do you guys have, or what have you thought about him?
Let's see. Shades of Deontay Johnson.
Yeah, that's a good fit. Yeah, Stephon Diggs.
He's just so springy, man. Like Deontay Johnson with pogo sticks for legs. Like, that'd probably be what I have in there. He can fly, dude. Not enough credit for that.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. We got Garrett. I heard you're a little bit down on Olave. I've seen, the yak numbers. I've seen the, inability to break tackles. It does seem like maybe he's getting a little bit too knocked for that. I don't know. The dude's a deep threat. He's out there running crispy routes, inside the 5 and everything as well. I believe that PFF's Mike Renner has been on record with the Calvin Ridley comp for Chris Olave. Sounds like you're not quite that high on him.
Yeah. I mean, I got a Devonta Smith hype comp. Okay. So, I think that's pretty strong. He's really intelligent. Yeah. It's just, again, it's kind of like Dotson, right? You have physical traits that, aren't going to translate in the same way that they did in the college game, where they're creating all this space for him. He can just run around and do whatever he wants after the catch. You're not going to get that in the NFL. So you're losing a little bit of that production output. Deep threat wise, I'm hoping for kind of like a T.Y. Hilton type fantasy value, right? So like an off and on wide receiver 2 kind of guy.
I would have loved for T.Y. to have gotten to be an overqualified wide receiver 2, like just for a little bit of his career. He did fine as their 1 and everything. This is not slandering T.Y. Hilton, but like Andrew, you had Andrew freaking Luck. You couldn't have done a little bit more to try to get him a higher end number 2. Like, come on, Indy. I think you mentioned before Jameson Williams with the Will Fuller comp. Is that just based on field, or are you tracking some funkiness with the moon already with Jameson?
Oh no, I'm not there yet. I'm hoping to get to that later because it'll be an interesting one. But Will Fuller I think is identical, right? You have all of the injury risk match perfectly with Jameson, and then all of the explosiveness. The strategy is there. Will Fuller is actually like super intelligent in terms of the way that he plays. Jameson's really the same way. As far as how he attacks the ball, what he's looking at when he's identifying coverage, and all of that deep speed. So I love Jameson Williams. He's a top 2 receiver in terms of film grade for me. But there's a ton of risk in terms of the injury that, for me, I'm more comfortable taking him at like 3-4, right? The end of your rookie first round.
I think Will Fuller still has maybe my single favorite collegiate play of the last, probably 8 years at this point, where they were playing USC. First play of the game, Adoree Jackson comes up and daps him up before the play. And then Fuller just runs straight past him for like a 75-yard touchdown. I saw Deshaun Kaiser afterward, like a couple years later, like just tweet a clip of it. And he had like the all 22 pre-play and was showing the handshake. So I'm pretty sure Kaiser and Fuller, like, were just laughing about that for years. And, I'm not trying to shit on Adoree. I think he took a screen to the house that game. And Adoree's one of those corners too, man, where like him, I think Darius Slay has gotten this at times too. We're like, they're tracking the number one receiver on the other team with almost no help. Like, we can't be shitting on them if they're getting beat, having an assignment that a lesser corner wouldn't have even been asked to do in the first place. So keep that in mind that, pretty hard to play cornerback, I think, in the year 2022, particularly if you're going to be one of those shadow corners. We went through the top 5. You've been talking a lot about George Pickens. Is he the one wide receiver that you think, this time next year could be inside suddenly of the top 5 fantasy receivers in this class?
Yes. Yeah. I think that, pretty straightforward on that. I think we'll see, a good amount of guys say, Pickens he's like that surprise sleeper. So if you're looking at the counting stats, right, he's a classic Georgia receiver. He's not putting up 1,000-yard season, but when you're talking about all that market share data, people love him. So George Pickens, I think, is a guy that people are just generally, like the general public is sleeping on, but the dynasty community, they're very in on George Pickens.
What are your overall thoughts on Skyy Moore? He's someone that PFF actually has as the number 6 receiver in the class, overall ranked number 33. Only 5'10", 195, but seems like, if you look a little bit closer at the film, I know Austin Gale comped him to Golden Tate. Might not, even though he is a little smaller, doesn't necessarily play smaller. And hey, if he, looking at these wide receivers, man, 2 of them you would like to think are going to end up on Green Bay or Kansas City. And if it's going to be at the end of the round, maybe someone like Skyy Moore or Jahan Dotson or George Pickens, even if the talent isn't that wide between, them and the top 5 guys, they land in that golden situation. All of a sudden the hype's going through the roof.
Oh yeah. And situation absolutely matters. So, Skyy Moore is a guy that I think is definitely interesting. He's going to get kind of my second tier grade. Okay. There's things that I, like as far as after the catch, I think he led college football in broken tackles for wide receivers. So he's in that category in terms of his usability on the ground. But what I see in Skyy Moore is a little bit of Christian Kirk. So more of a linear athlete, thickly built, versatile, but again, like pretty straightforward, doesn't necessarily have solutions for physical cornerback play. And so to me, Christian Kirk, again, ton of hype coming out, but that's kind of my match. Other people will say like Golden Tate. That was my comp for Christian Kirk. So, we're in that category of this guy can be a dog, right? He's just got some development to do. But the other thing too, like I got to go into his all 22. I just got a couple more games. Like so far I hadn't watched any. So he's the only player I couldn't get film on it, and we just got some today. So he's my next eval. Always
an ongoing evaluation process for sure. Favorite sleeper wide receiver that's not even guaranteed to be a day 1 or day 2 pick. I'm sure there's, some concerns out there, but maybe you see something in them that others don't.
So I would say Kyle Phillips is interesting, and he's like a, Hunter Renfrow dart throw, and that's like the easy, obvious comp. But when I use that comp, I mean it, as like in every way that you can, not just because they're white, but because Kyle is really juicy in and out of his breaks. He destroyed LSU in terms of how slippery he was, and so. They also used him at like fullback. So, and they didn't use him at fullback. That's an exaggeration. They used him to block. So he's pulling around and he's blowing up guys in the run game. And to me, that was impressive enough to be like, there's something to this guy, right? UCLA just overall dysfunctional, right? The quarterback play overall not great. But Kyle Phillips being this, slippery route runner, and then also a guy that likes to go in and bang. To me, that's something that we could say, okay, there's something there. And he'll, he can end up being 5th, 6th round pick. He's a guy that I think, I'm just going to listen to the camp news on, right? If they say, oh yeah, this guy, he might find his way on the field. Hey, I'm going to pick him up, right? He's not going to cost you anything. So he's a guy that I'm looking out for.
That's when preseason really comes into the fold. Like, I understand that what the person does in the fourth quarter, when Ramondre Stevenson busts a 90-yard touchdown against a bunch of janitors, like, I'm not going to radically change my opinion on him with that. But like, oh my God, dude, like we're going to start getting these news reports on like the depth charts that the third string interns putting together. And everyone's going to lose their damn minds out of that instead of just watching the first 10 minutes of the preseason game where we can see all the first team snaps out there. So yeah, someone like Kyle Phillips, man, hey, there are, basically 96 starting wide receiver spots out there. Maybe some of these, later round guys do land in one of the few situations where they can seize one of those sooner rather than later. We talked a little bit about Will Fuller already, but two big fans right here of the man. Still a free agent. Do you have a best case landing spot for Will Fuller? I know last year, having the finger injury, every time you quip about Will Fuller on Twitter, there's some idiot hater out there that just says, he'll play 5 snaps here before he gets hurt. All that nonsense aside, where would you most prefer to see Will Fuller playing football next year?
Well, yeah, I think I'll say Kansas City. I think that's pretty obvious for everybody, right? But
yeah.
they've shown that they're willing to take gambles on players. So I think of like Josh Gordon, right, being there. Will Fuller can be a guy that they could, I don't see any issues with them taking a flyer on, right? But what like the reason why I say KC is also because Will Fuller against KC week 1, I believe of the 2020 season. That was when I started to tune into this moon phase stuff. So we had a gibbous moon that night, and I was like, all right, I've been studying Will Fuller for a bit. I'm gonna bet on Will Fuller, and he had a monster game, so I won a little bit of money on that. But yeah, the moon phase thing, that was legit for a while.
Dude, it kept working every single time. I love it. One of the best, I think, ongoing trends out there. For those that don't know, like Will Fuller's production is just entirely tied to the moon. There's a lot of things I don't understand in life, but that is one certainty that JetPack has been able to uncover. Green Bay, I think, would be another obvious, pretty great one for Will Fuller, but let's just see him out there, man. The last full game, fully healthy. I'm gonna forget the Miami, tenure even happened. Like we saw him on that Thanksgiving, and it was him and Duke Johnson just going off against the Lions. It was like one of my happiest Sundays of my life. And now Will Fuller just can't get back on the field. So come on, Will. We still believe in you. Maybe even Cleveland, man. I would like to see Donovan Peoples-Jones get his chance to be their number 2. But I mean, obviously, if we could reunite Fuller and Watson on field, that'd be some fireworks. JetPack, fantastic stuff. We talked about most of the wide receiver class, but I want to talk about another current professional that we both share a bit of an affinity for, Mo Alie-Cox. The man looks like he's 7 feet tall and 400 pounds on the field. You've taken a nice little liking to basically just photoshopping the man and making him really look as big as I think some of the phone grinders notice as well. He just got paid, I believe, 3 years, $18 million. Jack Doyle retired. Is Mo Alie-Cox your late round tight end pick of 2022? Because right now, man, I've been on the record more with Irv Smith, but he's kind of going like top 15 or so already. Mo Alie-Cox is legitimately there in the late rounds to be had, and I don't see why not.
Yeah, definitely a fan of his size. Obviously, he's a guy. So I do all my film watching through a telescope, and he just immediately pops. Right, he's just so massive. But yeah, I think he's definitely got some sleeper potential, like you're talking about with the situation. The other guy that I'm pretty interested in is Gerald Everett. So Gerald Everett is a guy that I liked coming out of college, and obviously he's a 2nd round pick, all that kind of stuff. He had that kind of slippery after the catch type deal, and when we're talking about the Chargers being a great place for a tight end to come out and really take on some serious volume, Gerald Everett, I think, he's in that like tight end 20 range, and that's a great spot. So yes, I love Mo Alie-Cox, but Gerald Everett is a guy that I'm definitely interested in.
Yeah, I'd be curious to see how much they split things between Everett and Donald Parham. But I mean, with Everett, it's always just been a matter of like, let's feature him. We've seen him get it done. But then it was Tyler Higbee, Will Dissly for a little bit. Now potentially Parham, just making that tough for him to get the full-time role. But a man can dream. Hey, all right, who's this dude you just tweeted about, I think yesterday, the Virginia guy? How big is this freaking tight end from Virginia? Because he looks like he's like 9 feet tall.
Yeah, he's legitimately bigger than Mo Alie-Cox.
Oh my God! Who is he? What's his name?
Jelani Woods. So he's 6'7", and he runs a 4.6.
Oh my God!
And he's just a monster. So you watch his highlights. He's just like, just a giant playing with these kids.
Is he coming out this year?
He's coming out this year. Yeah. He's
move over, Trey McBride. What are we doing here?
People are actually in on him. So yeah, he's an interesting guy. But so both Mo Alley and Jelani, they're just like so huge that they look really stiff. Yeah. But I mean, they'll break tackles and they run hard and all that kind of stuff. It's a lot of entertainment there when you're watching these guys.
Dude, yeah, and I'm not quite in the weeds of college football as much as some other guys, but I usually catch up when I'm just doing all the preseason DFS goodness. That's how Mo Alie-Cox, Auden Tate. I think when I've seen some of these guys play against like lesser competition and they're really able to master the contested catches and stuff like that. That's a little bit harder against the starters. Whatever. I was getting Like my buddy Derek Brown was giving me shit for liking receivers that don't separate. And my comeback was like, sorry, I want a wide receiver that, isn't going to get denied at half the freaking rides at a roller coaster park. So, that back in my day, it was a good thing to be over 6 feet tall and have a little bit of weight behind you. So JetPack, fantastic stuff. Again, everyone can find you on Twitter at JetPack Galileo. You and the fantasy football astronauts always doing fantastic work. You're on YouTube and at Patreon as well. Anything you want to get off your chest before we get out of here, my friend?
Yeah, so we're launching our rookie guide next week. Again, all those film grades, the attention to detail, everything is going into that. We're doing more than receivers. We got all these positions for fantasy guys. So that's at ffastronauts.com. Make sure to check that out. That rookie guide will be dropping next week. Very excited about that.
Takes a true confidence to be putting out your rookie guide and stuff before the actual draft happens. We obviously know how much that helps. So, true respect to you, all the other astronauts you're working with for, grinding that now, being ahead of the field on it. And I hope, your success dominating, the fantasy of just perspective versus the NFL draft continues, man. Awesome stuff from you and the rest of the crew. We appreciate your time. For JetPack, I'm Ian. Thanks to those for tuning in to PFF Fantasy Football Podcast. And until next time, take care, everybody.